All right, so we're recording now. So for those on the recording, what this means is this is a kickoff call where we want to start talking about asynchronous workflows and asynchronous pipelines inside of GitLab. We have a number of categories coming up that are going to require a somewhat different paradigm from our users and how they interact with us compared to our normal CI pipelines. Specifically, as we're going to be focusing on DAST, PKI management, and fuzz testing. All of these categories require relatively long-running jobs on the order of hours to potentially days or even weeks. And our current pipelines are not such a great fit for that, where we expect a developer to commit code and wait for the pipeline's results. So really one of the goals of this meeting was to kind of discuss that use case, really dig into kind of that problem space more to make sure we all understand it and are on the same page from a product design and engineering perspective. And then if we have time left, start some ideation around solutions and some other things to explore.
Yeah, so Sam, the one thing that I would tweak that a little bit is when we talk about long running jobs, certainly I know DAST can be a very long running job. We've had customers, in fact, even dog fooding it ran longer than a day to do a full DAST scan of the GitLab. So DAST, fuzzing, so those tend to be very long running jobs. PKI, I think, would not necessarily be a long running job, but I think the reason maybe that we want to cluster it in here is PKI is something that you may want to run just outside of a pipeline. So it's not necessarily related to a build, right? Like your SSL certificate, you're probably not doing a lot of work in your build regarding an SSL certificate, but you want to check your SSL or some of your other PKI infrastructure outside of a pipeline that's independent of commits.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, you definitely want to be monitoring those periodically, not even though they're not necessarily long running.
Oh, I have a question about KPI. So I did a quick search on KPIs like public key infrastructure, and that is related to the secrets scan we're talking about, or like they're completely different?
So slightly different. So PKI management, the MVC that we have written right now is going to be about monitoring sites for the certificates that are used and being able to say these are about to expire or have expired.
Ah, okay. It's not
so
public.
Yeah. So the periodic nature is, we need to just run that check every so often because, it's going to go out of date eventually. So we need to keep checking until we can provide some sort of alert or info to the user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you look at the non-technical version of that is, you go to a website, it's HTTP, or you go to a website, it's HTTPS. Mm-hmm. That HTTPS requires this certificate that you have to renew on, depending on the service, but anywhere from every 30 days or 90 days to a year. So those have to get renewed. So those can get expired. They expire, that HTTPS doesn't work. Also, when you set those up, there's a bunch of different encryption keys and protocols that you have to set up. Mm-hmm. And as time goes on, what happens is a lot of those protocols kind of get deprecated, and then we move to more sophisticated protocols and encryption keys. So the PKI infrastructure would be monitoring those and making sure that you're deprecating the old encryption keys so that you're using newer ones so that your website continues to be very secure and not subject to old encryption.
Cool. So the reason that this is not part of like the automatic CI/CD pipeline is like user don't need it to run regularly. They probably do it like only like every month or every 90 days.
Right.
And it needs extra like configuration.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you could be checking in your code all day long, and my code is really never going to touch the HTTPS certificate. So there's no reason to run it on every pipeline. It's just one of those things that you just want to run kind of in the background, like you said, every 30 days or 90 days. And, long-term, we can get really smart about it, right? If we know that the expiration is, I don't know, December 31st, we may be able to say, you know what, we're not going to run the scan until November. because we know that it's not going to expire for a while, so we can be really smart and efficient about it.
Yeah, like automatically scheduling for them.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So Seth, one question I had about a comment you made, you said DAS can run for sometimes a day right now. Is that with our current infrastructure? How do customers do that? Because I think our timeout by default is 60 minutes, right?
Yeah,
So
so
how do customers do that?
I'd have to double check, but I believe when you set up I believe it's on the YAML side, you set up your timeout for your runner. So in your YAML, you just set what the timeout is, and then you just run your job. And as long as your timeout is greater than the length of the job, it will continue to run. One of the areas that I think is really unfortunate is if you set your timeout too early. Let's say you set your timeout to an hour and your job is still running after an hour. It's just because of the way our scanners work is they have to finish, generate a report, and then send that back to GitLab. So if you time out first, all of that work kind of gets thrown out because the report's not finished.
So it's not just a matter of we're going to stop it early and you get interim results. It's we stopped it, you get 0 results.
Right, exactly. So to run a long running job right now, you can do it no problem. You just set your timeout to a very long period of time.
Okay, but you have to know what that timeout is to set it correctly, and if you get it wrong, then you wasted a huge amount of time.
Right, or yeah, exactly. Or you just set it to be very generous. If you think it's going to take a couple hours, you set it to a day. But then, of course, the problem with that is you could end up wasting resources, or things don't close down properly.
So I guess the thinking with the timeout then is that we're really trying to set an upper bound on what the job is allowed to do, because we don't expect it to do anywhere close to that amount. Right. I think the difference in the problem we're talking about now, though, is we don't know what an upper bound of these jobs will be. We expect them to be very long running. I'm wondering if this is pointing to, that timeout limit is not really the right approach we should be using for this use case, but rather be focused on informing and letting a user manually kill things if it's been a year, for example, but not do it automatically.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 pieces of this that we want to think about. The first, and there's an issue open for this, which is potentially streaming results from the job to GitLab. So if you're streaming results to GitLab, then your dashboard or whatever can be updating with new vulnerabilities as they're coming in. And that's one thing that's really nice is if you have a long running job, you may have a long tail in terms of the vulnerabilities that are found. You might find a bunch when you first start that scan, right? It finds a bunch of header problems, so on and so forth. And then it just continues, but it finds it finds fewer and fewer vulnerabilities as time goes on. So that's why a streaming service might make a lot of sense, where it streams those results as the job is running. And that would give you a couple of things. One, you could say, okay, it's run for 10 hours, and in the last hour it found no vulnerabilities or no new vulnerabilities. Everything it's finding is duplicate of what it's already reported. And so you could set rules like, okay, if you haven't found a new vulnerability in the last hour, let's quit, right? Or maybe if you haven't found a new vulnerability in the last 2 hours, quit. So you could set rules as to how the engine itself kills itself, and that would actually be within the software itself, the scanner. So that's one way of doing it. I think the other thing that's important is introducing some idea of a health check, because the streaming helps with the health, because that things are running because new vulnerabilities are coming in, but it's still possible, like It's not finding anything and it's still running and it's still healthy. So you need to introduce some kind of idea of a health check that says, hey, I'm a scanner, I'm still running, everything's good. And that needs to be, GitLab needs to be pinged every 5 minutes, that says, hey, this is still healthy. And then if it misses 1 or 2 health checks, GitLab says, okay, that's a dead runner, and stops listening for that runner.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point too, because with DAST and fuzzing especially, we're very likely to just break the application in some way. So, a health check seems like a great way to make sure that, the scanner hasn't just crashed the system and that's why it's not reporting.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, certainly with fuzzing, there's a lot of different strategies as to when you stop fuzzing. Again, it could be you're not finding new vulnerabilities, or in fuzzing, it's faults, right? You're not finding any new faults. Everything you find is already been in there. You could set it up for a duration of time. I know some tools say, you know what, we're just going to go indefinitely, and we're gonna kill the process when we have a new build. And so we'll kill the process, new build comes in, we'll start fuzzing that, picking up where we left off using the corpus and the data sets that we've already run.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those, I think the point of those is they're running essentially outside of a pipeline, right? There's no,
it's not tied to a code commit necessarily that a developer hand wrote.
And the way I think about pipelines, if you think about it really from like a QA process, right? The idea of a pipeline is very deterministic, right? I put in code, I'm going to run all the same tests. If those tests are good, I can push this out to a server to production in a perfect world, right? And that's one of the reasons we don't stop a pipeline based on vulnerabilities, because it requires some human interaction to say, nope, I need to push the brakes on this. We're never going to stop someone from going out to production because of a vulnerability, particularly since they're not necessarily deterministic. Fuzzing, it's finding faults. These aren't necessarily problems that would prevent you from going to production or anything of that sort. And so they don't really fit into that paradigm of like, if you don't get through this pipeline, you should not go to production. It's just a lot of data that you have to sort through and figure out how you want to respond to that. But it really doesn't necessarily fit inside this idea of, if it fails, don't go. If it passes, go.
Yeah, that's probably a point that it'd be good to be very specific on, because I see fuzzing especially as two different approaches. We'll have a quick scan version of fuzzing, which will always run in, say, 5 to 10 minutes. It's intended to be run on every commit. That may or may not block the pipeline based on an end user settings, but to your point, yeah, these long range scans, these are never intended to block a pipeline from completing, because they're going to be running for that long period of time.
Right.
So they should be done, outside of the pipeline that a developer is working through.
And I think the relationship to a pipeline is, it's a good time to start the job, right? Which is like, hey, there's new code that just got committed, or a new tag, or a new, something happened to the repo, and we should kick off a new fuzzing job, right? Or a new dash job. So it's a good point to instantiate the process, but not necessarily hold up a process because you're waiting for results from that.
I'm trying to type down what we're saying as we go through it.
And when they use the word like job and without the context of pipeline, so user understand that this is standing alone job. Or
I don't know the terminology. Job is a fair word to use, but obviously job is loaded with the job that we have in pipeline. So we may need to figure out another word for it.
Okay.
I think job is not such an unreasonable place to start, though. I think since we do talk about jobs in context of pipelines, users understand conceptually that it is a unit of compute and work that's usually orchestrated as a pipeline. I think if we continue to use that term, they would still understand what we're talking about, even if it wasn't in context of like a pipeline kicked off from a commit necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of the term job right now is jobs are run on, on your runners, which is exactly how we would be doing this. So for all intents and purposes, we are running a job. The only thing that I don't like about the word job is right now it only exists within the context of a pipeline. So there may be a way of saying we're running I don't know, a detached job, a non-pipeline job, instantiated jobs, some other word or adjective,
Yeah,
I guess.
that's actually a good segue to one point I wanted to talk about is how can we reuse what we have in the product today to iterate quickly rather than building something brand new. Um, I was looking at our existing pipelines and I put some links there, but we have the notion of scheduled pipelines as well as child parent pipelines. I'm curious if these give us some opportunities to use these to essentially kick off these async pipelines rather than having to build a whole new paradigm and set of terminology for users to understand.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the scheduled pipelines, I played around with that. So you can set up a job, whatever your rules are, and then say only on schedule. And so it only runs on a scheduled basis. So that's actually a way that you could do things like our PKI that says only on a schedule. And then you go in and you put a schedule, whatever, the first of every month. And then that becomes independent of commits and things of that sort. So that could be a really simple way of doing the PKI. It doesn't give you a web interface. Like we're just relying on all the existing GitLab infrastructure to do that.
Correct. It would just be in that pipeline tab.
Right. So if you did that, then yeah, that's pretty straightforward. You just set that up. There's nothing new that has to get built.
Okay. One thing I did also find interesting, I didn't know this existed until yesterday. I was looking at the API documentation. We can schedule pipelines and manually start them programmatically. And I put a link to a repository where I was doing some experiments there. I'm wondering if we could run the pipeline for a user as part of the normal CI/CD flow and start what we call a scheduled pipeline, but essentially with no schedule. We just use scheduled pipelines as a way to host it and then start it manually. Because what that would do is it would decouple the fuzzing or the DAS long running pipeline from the user's, I did a commit of code pipeline. And then presumably we could set the timeout settings for that as, to infinity in the short term or until we figure out how to do better timing out.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing that you can do that I found is you can programmatically create jobs in source code in the Rails monolith. We could create a job and run that job, and it wouldn't actually ever need to exist in a YAML file. We haven't played around with that to see where does it show up on the web interface, what happens, what's your traceability, things of that sort. Because right now, when a job happens, you can go back and look at the GitLab YAML file and see what the configuration was, so on and so forth. But we could actually do all that stuff programmatically and not rely on any kind of YAML file.
And this schedule pipeline is also not related on YAML file. So
the schedule pipeline, you can do schedule pipelines right now that are based on the YAML file. Sam, I don't know if you were talking about something. You're still Sam, what you were talking about is still based on the YAML file. It's just through the API you can kick it off, right?
Correct. So the idea I'm proposing, users would never see it. This would all be inside of that fuzzing.yaml template or das.yaml template. This would just be something we GitLab would use to write that template ourselves.
I see. Okay.
So from a customer perspective, I think the two are the exact same in that they never see them. I think we want to always make sure that what we do here is transparent to users, because I think this is going to be complex if we need them to do something. So as much as we can, I'd like to steer away from user configuring things.
So Sam, and what you're talking about, if I were to go to my scheduled pipelines, would I see anything in the web interface?
With this approach, yes.
Okay. Yep.
So the approach that repo is taking is it's scheduling a pipeline to be run once every year, so essentially never. It's setting all the variables that would be needed. So I just used fuzz testing enabled as an example. Then it hits the API endpoint to start the pipeline, and then it can delete the scheduled pipeline after it's done.
Oh, I see.
or
Okay.
after it started rather. So that'll delete the schedule so it won't need to be there anymore, but the pipeline itself will be running at that point.
Okay. Got it. So with the
And that's
creation,
meant to be just, and that is meant just to be a proof of concept to explain the idea. I don't expect that is,
okay.
production ready code.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the infrastructure is there to allow us to do a lot of these things. The question that I have with that is like, it's a little confusing because it's like, we're not really running a scheduled thing in the traditional sense. So we're overloading some of these concepts. And I wouldn't want to leave our implementation that way for too long, because then it kind of waters down like, what is a scheduled pipeline? And it just makes how that stuff gets used pretty cloudy. It may be literally just having another screen and we have a flag like this is a scheduled pipeline versus this is a PKI job or something else, just so that we can separate those jobs and we keep, the terminology and everything consistent and clean.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I think it would be kind of confusing for customers and users if they started seeing schedules that they didn't put there.
Yep.
Perhaps we would add something to hide those, like a flag or I don't know.
A tab or something, but you just want to keep all the design and the experience consistent.
Exactly. And kind of to that point, I think the interface we would have to this to make sure that we're not overloading, say, scheduled pipelines inappropriately or some other interface. I think really the key jobs we would need to be doing is users would need to know how these async pipelines are started. They'd need to be able to see them on an ongoing basis, so they could get that info about, the health check coming in and just understand what's happening, because this will be using compute resources that will presumably be using their minutes or some sort of resource allocation, as well as the ability to kill these pipelines. Because like we said, if the fuzzer or the DAS scanner, go completely sideways and wreck the system, they need to be able to kill those jobs.
Yeah, and I haven't played around with killing jobs to understand exactly how that functionality works. I don't know if it's that the runner is pulling GitLab and then GitLab would just send a kill command on its next health check, or how that would work.
So the way I assume it's working, and that's the big disclaimer, it's an assumption, is that all of our jobs are being run inside of containers. And so the GitLab runner daemon is able to receive messages and just kill those containers if needed.
Okay. Yeah, we'll want to play around with that.
Yeah.
Because I think certainly fuzzing has a great opportunity to just go on forever or crash. I mean, that's what it's trying to do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, I think there's a couple of questions on the killing jobs, right? Is making sure that it stops the use of your minutes if that's the case. If you're fuzzing against a live or a testing website or whatever, you may want to stop that. So we have to figure out like, what does it mean to kill it? Is it going to stop all the attacks? Is it just going to stop taking results and it's just going to let it die on its own?
Yeah, great point. Let's write that one down and we can dig into that one more too. Does it stop everything? Does it report current results? That's it. Something else. Maybe we're talking around like a graceful versus a forced shutdown.
Right.
Like, on your Mac, you can do like end process or force stop.
Yep.
Maybe that's something we can explore.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of depends on how bad the problem is, right? Like
Oh,
go ahead.
Oh, I was like looking at like end process. End process means user can restart it again. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, like it's on your Mac, like if you shut down on your Mac, it'll usually keep all the status of your Windows and all that kind of stuff. Versus if you just hold down the power button, then like everything else, you have to start things back up.
Maybe we could use a little animation of a guy unplugging a power cord
Right.
for the ultimate killing of processes. Okay. All right. Well, so that I think that covers some pretty good things. What else would we need to talk about, like in the problem space? Like, is the problem clear still, and we can keep doing solution brainstorming, or any other questions there first?
I have one question, like, is like the 3A area. So when, no matter like which technology we use, like schedule pipeline or this programmatically create jobs, that means we can use interface in a different, like under the security tab. We don't have to redirect user to the pipeline page, right? We can just kind of bring the technology behind the schedule pipeline to a different area.
Yeah, I think so. I think if we can keep our user in the security page, that's probably better for them because that's where they're going to be used to interacting with their vulnerabilities, their configurations, and everything anyways.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of my preference is that, and I don't know what the balance is. Like if we have a lot of this show up on our own security version of the pipeline page, then it's very clear. Like, hey, here's my dash jobs, here's my PKA jobs, here's my whatever jobs they are that are security related. One of the problems that I have when you go to the pipeline page is it's just everything's a pipeline, right? Everything's a pipeline and it's got ref name and the SHA, and you don't really know what it's doing, and you don't know that those are job like specific to security or to anything else. And so the idea I think is if we know that these pipelines or these jobs are just a security scan, it would be nice that we have a security scan page and it lists out the jobs that says, you know, security scan 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. And you don't have to go digging through your pipeline into the jobs to find what we just ran. Because I think it'll be really confusing if like we kick stuff off and then you've got to go, you know, search through the rest of it.
Yeah, I also think that's confusing. Yeah.
I completely agree. I think those are great points.
Those,
Because yeah, I mean, pipelines are a great way. Like that's more of the how we can achieve the experience we want, but it's not the experience we want, right? We don't want customers spelunking in the pipeline view or the pipeline screen.
So I think the way that it might work, if we use all the existing infrastructure, our stuff is all going to show up in the pipelines and in the jobs pages. But I think, and I'm just kind of brainstorming here, I think if our job names have a specific name or a report type, we can query the database and say, give me all jobs, names, secure, whatever. And then we can create an output of all those jobs. So ours is basically a subset of what exists on the other part of the site.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So one of the points that was raised when I think we discussed this a few weeks ago with some other folks is that this could potentially add more noise to that pipeline and job page versus what is there today. Thinking about it some more though, and kind of what we just talked about, I don't think that customers go directly to that pipeline page generally. I think they go to it via the merge request or a dashboard. So I want to hear what you all think, but to me, it doesn't seem like that's that much of a downside if we did want to add, you know, if more jobs and pipelines are added to these screens. Do you all have any thoughts on that?
At least from, I agree with you, at least from my own personal use case. Like the pipeline page is just like everything's in there. If you wanted to go sort through it, you could. Generally, I would go through a pipeline through my merge request. In particular, because like if I've got a merge request and I keep adding commits to it or whatever, I don't really care about all the previous versions of the pipeline. All I care about is the most recent one, which is going to be linked on that merge request. So sometimes I'll go to the pipeline page, but like that pipeline page is very, very noisy. If you go look at a big project like GitLab, you know, that pipeline page is not really going to help you that much. It's fine. I think there's other use cases of why you might use that to say, okay, how many runners am I using? How many pipelines are in process at any given point? But generally not for interacting with the data. Like you're not going to go to the pipeline page, click on it, look at each of the tabs, do it that way. I think you're much more likely to do it through the merge request. But that's my sample of one. That's about it.
Yeah, I can talk with like the designers from the pipeline like stage and to see like what they think users are using it. Like if we add those things, like do they like if we have a different profile, like security analysis are creating it and it shows up under the security tab, but it's also automatically under the pipeline tab that is a noise like they're targeting user. If it does, we might be able to hide it like with a setting or something. And if not, then they can leave it there. So I can have a quick chat with them to see what they think.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I wouldn't be
that'd be
worried.
helpful.
I wouldn't be too worried about adding noise into the pipelines page. I guess another way of saying this is I don't think we would be the problem. If there's a problem, it's already there, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
if you pull up like the GitLab one right now, I'll just throw it in the chat so we've got it.
I've seen it before. It's it's
like,
pretty busy.
Right now it says all is 1,000 plus, and I don't know what this is, probably 20 per page, and there's a bunch that are still running.
It's a lot of clicking.
So I don't know who's actually using this page to do much work. And frankly, I would imagine even a lot of our customers have a similar kind of experience where they've got thousands of pipelines running. Like, this isn't
okay. Well,
this is not a primary way of dealing with the data. So it's there.
Okay. Well, so it sounds like we're all pretty much agreed on this with the info we have now. Camelia, if you hear something different from the other teams, let's talk about it. But I did want to bring up this point because, this is an assumption. So I want to make sure it's explicit that we'd be okay adding more noise potentially to these screens without negatively impacting users too much. And it sounds like we're okay with that right now.
And I don't think we would be adding any disproportionate amount of data, right? I mean, some of these pipelines that are out there, it's like, hey, I'm going to run it on like linting, right? If you run a linter, you're running it on every commit, every tiny little change. And that's going to be a heck of a lot more noisy than our security scans, which are going to get kicked off on a less frequent basis.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, what else then?
I mean, I think the question ultimately that I have in terms of how this gets implemented is what's our primary interface going to look like to instantiate these jobs, and trying to understand what that looks like. Because I think the pipeline and all that is frankly a lot more behind the scenes. And the question is like, okay, if we're going to kick off a fuzzing job, what is that screen going to look like to kick that fuzzing job off? How are we going to do that? And I know we don't have answers for that right now, but that's kind of to me, one of the next steps is figuring out like, where do we start with the fuzzing or a DAST? And I'm working with Derek on the DAST side.
Yeah, and I just created the DAST like interface with the steps, but I think maybe it's too advanced for MVC, but it's kind of like good for us to look at it and then how to cut it down from there.
Okay.
And yeah, I mentioned you in the issue. I've also mentioned Sam there, so you can have a look.
Okay.
I think like the configuration for DAST and fuzzing will be different, but how we show the like schedule pipelines or jobs, how we call it, will be similar.
Okay, cool.
Start from there.
Yeah, is that in Figma or is that in a different place?
In Figma.
Would it be helpful to review what we've got up to this point now that we've got everyone on the call?
Yeah, I can do that. I can share my screen.
Cool.
So this is what I have done so far. So we have like on-demand scan like under security. So it's basically empty at the beginning and the user can start like here a new DAST job or like they can click on drop down and to start a fuzzing or something else. And for new DAST scan, those are the configurations that I quickly talk with Derek. So it will be like you choose a target branch and you create a new configuration profile at the first time, and later on you can choose from the drop-down existing profile. So it will saving all those kind of settings. I'm not sure about those settings though. I create a separate Google Doc for us to figure out like which scan have which settings. I'm just guessing here. And after like user created, like I think now it's just immediately start and later we can schedule it, or like we can schedule it immediately. Like it depends on our capacity or what they define MVC. And after you create this, and I'm thinking about just show a simple list about like, okay, this is DAST active scan and this is a target and it's running, and you can stop it and go to details. And go to details, it depends on like the streaming or not, so you show a result or not, it depends. And I also quickly list out if there are more, what are the scenarios. And it's like the running one, you can stop it, and already finished one, or like you stopped it, like you can rerun it in a way. And you can also cancel running, like a scheduled one. So that's, I think maybe we have more scenario we can list there. And I'm not sure, like for fuzzing is also use target as kind of identifier for jobs, or I should have a like job ID here or something. That part I'm not sure yet. We can add ID, like pipeline ID, schedule pipeline, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, I really like this. I think this is exactly what we were talking about in terms of that interface to start, monitor, and stop async jobs. Yeah, we'll definitely have to dig into what are those fuzzing specific settings, but I think they would fit in this paradigm pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting whether we want to have like on-demand scans or whether the tab on the left will be DAST and then fuzzing and break that down into each individual one. Because I could see a lot of differences between this screen and fuzzing.
Yeah, you mean like on the top we have the tabs. Like,
right, yeah, so you've got target here. Fuzzing has a different idea of targets. It does have targets, but it tends to be like a function in your code. So maybe on-demand scans is a shared page, and then fuzzing. Yeah, so yeah, you could do it this way too, as you've got tabs.
Yeah, or like under this as well. We'll see like it should be vertical or horizontal. But I just remember, like I will put this idea there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sam, the question for on-demand scans is how we think about these as products in GitLab. Like, are we thinking about it as like a single security tool, or we want to kind of call out each individual tool more as a first class tool? So like on the left where it says on-demand scans, like is that going to be DAST scans, fuzzing scans, or we want to kind of group them? And some of that I think is more of a positioning for GitLab as opposed to a design problem.
Yeah, let me do some more thinking on that one, and I think we'll probably need to try some experiments. At a high level, though, the thought process I'm using, we sell one product at GitLab. It's GitLab and Ultimate for the security scans. It's important that we are specific enough that customers understand the value and what each of these functionality pieces is doing. It's not so critical, we get them split up so much that it looks like each one's its own product, if that makes sense, because your subscription gets you all of them. I mean, it'd be a different discussion if we sold a fuzzing license and a DAST license and a SaaS license, but that's not how we do things today.
Yeah, and maybe there's a short and a long-term solution, right? Like as these products are less mature, maybe they're grouped under on-demand scans, and then as they mature out, we bring them out to their own separate left-hand nav. Anyway, we don't need to go down that whole thing right now.
Yeah.
But
it's a point we will need to dig into more, but I think you're right. It's more of a longer term thing once these get further along. I'm wondering about some of the phrasing of on demand. That would mean that we can't really put PKI management here because that's not an on demand thing. That's more of a continuous monitoring thing where we want to just say, every day check to make sure my site is secure. I don't know. It's a naming question primarily, so I'm sure we can do some brainstorming on specifics.
Yep.
But I think this page really should speak to the workflow that it's asynchronous outside of a pipeline, not necessarily that it's you manually start it on demand.
Yeah.
That would be confusing to me as a user.
Yeah. So I know we don't have too much time left. I've got there's a lot we could talk about on these screens. I don't know whether we should set up another meeting, maybe with Derek, or if we've got another one to kind of go through these and brainstorm what works, what doesn't, and what the best way to go through this is.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue. We should probably talk about next steps from where we go from here. Yeah, so Camelia, definitely appreciate you walking us through the screens that you have now. These look really good. And we identified a number of different areas where we have open questions around this problem space that we need to dig into a little bit more. So let's talk about what we want to do next. So we have the asynchronous workflow epic. I think creating issues under that makes the most sense. I think 3A, there is an open question around what do we do from a technical perspective of how do we do some of this work on a scheduling basis, whether we can use something we have in pipelines today, programmatically make jobs, something else entirely. Do you all agree that's an action item we need to take out of this to figure that answer out?
Yeah, I think that's fine. My personal preference, to be honest, in terms of how to move this forward, would be to work through these designs and try to refine these, at least among the product team, myself and Camilla, try to refine these designs. And then once we, basically the four of us have a good draft of these designs, get them in front of some of the engineers, and that's going to bring up some of these real technical questions of okay, how do we get that start button or that stop button or whatever it may be? How do we get that working? Because at least for an MVC, we're not going to be redoing a lot of GitLab infrastructure. So it's more going to be how do we implement the designs that we come up with? So I think for me, the most efficient way to do this is let's work through the designs. From there, we can go back and look at the engineering. The engineering may then say, okay, that's not going to work, and we'll have to come back to the design. But I think having that design as a starting point will help the engineers focus their attention.
Yeah, I think that'll work for me as well. You can start, I think we can all start commenting on the designs, and then later on next week, we can have a think meeting to see what are we think are usable for user, and then to see what are technical possible, and then we can start breaking it down. And when we have more concrete on the engineer side, this is a big change, I need to bring it to user to have a certain validations.
Yep.
So.
And I'm not sure how the best way to do this is, because your design basically shows what kind of the ideal situation is going to be. And then there's okay, we'll have that, and then we'll have to peel it back to figure out what our MVC is. Which I think is fine. I think that's easier than trying to do an MVC and then trying to figure out how we get to the next step. I actually prefer to think of what does it look like in 6 months or a year? And then, say, we'll only implement, this and this for the MVC.
Yeah, this is also a new try for me. Since I'm in GitLab, I'm always doing MVC first and then move on. And now I think maybe we try that out to see it's more beneficial or not.
Yeah.
And it's generally more suited for how the user-centered design works. You put user first and then work it down.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds like a good set of next steps to me then. Because I agree we should start at what the ideal case is and then peel it back. Just want to note that what the ideal case is will likely change as we learn more.
Right.
So as long as we're all okay, this is going to be iterative. We're probably going to we will get things wrong, and we'll make updates.
Yeah.
So whatever we come up with is going to need changing.
Yeah. The reason the ideal case is nice to look at from an engineering perspective is it allows us to think a little bit bigger in terms of like how we should be setting this up technically, as opposed to like, okay, we just kind of monkey patch it here, and then in 3 months we're like, oh crap, we got to throw all this stuff out. And so it's not that we're going to try to do any more work, at least for our MVC. It's just that we're going to try to make sure we do the right work.
Yeah. No, completely agree. And hopefully this meeting where we discuss the problem without discussing solutions is very helpful, especially for you folks watching at home on YouTube, because who knows what the data is that they're watching.
Yeah. So in terms of commenting on that, Camilla, what's the best step? Is there a mural board or how does that get, what's the best way to comment on those designs?
Oh, I quickly share it again. So here, like I share the link like in this issue. You can like the Figma file here.
14025.
Yeah.
So what's the title of that issue?
Is
Let's put a link in the
124,
document.
yeah.
Okay.
Also CC7 there. So if you open the link, you'll probably see this, and you just click the icon on the top, and you can start like draw point on anywhere there.
Okay, and so those are comments. Okay.
Yeah, those are comments. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I don't want to start changing the design, and you're like, why is all this text in here?
Yeah, no worries. Like I know
really
what I did.
cut it
I
down.
remember.
Read everything.
This whole design has all obsessed feelings in it.
Cool. I think I need to leave. And yeah.
Sounds great.
Talk to you
All
later.
right, sounds good.
All right, see ya.
Well, thanks, folks. Really appreciate the discussion. We'll talk soon.
All right, see ya.
See ya.